As I've said before, the NBA of the early 1990s is the era that I loved the most. It seems to me that this era combined the best of everything. You still had great fast breaks and good offense. But there was also plenty of good defense to go around. But you know, I think the real reason that I remember this era so fondly is because this is around the time I started to become interested in basketball simulators. And there was one sim in particular that I used to play all the time. This is it right here, APBA Professional Basketball for DOS. It was released sometime in 1991, and I know that my dad got a copy as soon as he bought a computer in late 1992. Now, in order to understand this text-based game and its significance, you really need to understand first a few things about the APBA Basketball board game that it was based on. At least you have to have a basic understanding of it, so let's look at it really quickly. The old APBA Basketball board game is notorious because of how unplayable it is. The components actually look amazing. In fact, it was one of those rare basketball board game simulations that had you actually move players around on the floor while you played. But if you take a closer look, you can see why this game was unplayable. I mean, just look at all those columns. The game came with this straight edge piece of plastic that you see on the bottom here, which was supposed to help you line up the play result numbers with the right columns. It's like a joke. The finder columns were a nightmare. Worst of all were the 3 sets of indexes that you had to make and then update as the game went on. You used these complex indexes in connection with dice rolls, meaning that you could roll the dice something like 5 times just to figure out who got the rebound. And honestly, I've only scratched the surface here. It's going to take me a while to work up the courage to really attack that board game again, but we will touch on the old APBA Basketball board game eventually. And honestly, it might take me a few months just to complete a single game. Anyway, you can imagine that it was a huge deal when the APBA Journal reported in early 1991 that a computerized version of the basketball game was going to come out soon. The author eloquently summarized the feelings of countless basketball fans who were frustrated by how unplayable the otherwise attractive board game was. It's not so impressive today, but at the time a lot of the statistical options and sorting features that came with the computer game seemed amazing. And as you can guess, the game really made a splash when it came out in the summer of 1991. But it wouldn't hold on to that APBA name for long, and honestly the connection between this game and the old APBA board game has always been a mystery. The designer and programmer, Ralph Rhodes, had originally worked on add-ons for the APBA Baseball DOS game, which means he probably had a working relationship with Miller Associates. It seems that Rhodes took the initiative to design a basketball game and sent it to APBA. And interestingly enough, Rhodes claimed that he developed a lot of simulation features in the game that simply could not exist in the board game. The problem though is that this computer game was closed source. It was closed source from the beginning, and there are really very few clues about precisely how the program works. That's why nobody knows if it's a souped up version of the old basketball board game or if it's a completely new game. Now, that relationship is pretty important to note since APBA and Rhodes' Cactus Developments actually parted ways sometime in early 1993, and I'm honestly not sure why. It seems that the split was amicable, though I really don't see how this could have benefited APBA. I mean, you would think that the company would have really wanted to keep such a popular product on board. The APBA Journal continued to provide coverage of the new Cactus basketball game through at least the end of 1993, though the coverage did fall off after that. Anyway, I was fortunate enough to discover a copy of version 3.0 of the old DOS game, and I became really excited. I've only got one season disc for it though, it's the 1991-92 season. And to be honest with you, it's really hard to find other season discs. Nobody seems to have them. But anyway, let's take a look and see what we've got. Well, as you can see, I'm using DOSBox for this, actually DOSBox X, which works fantastically well. When you first set the game up, you need to type in the nicknames of all the teams. I spelled bullets wrong. After you finish typing everything in, you can go into the game and look around. Now, because I remember what the APBA DOS baseball game was like, I assumed that I needed to make a new league for a replay. So I spent some time copying rosters and teams and so on. But it turns out that there's no way to copy a schedule or the transaction list. Now, you can just play with the teams out of the box and it will work fine. In other words, I didn't need to create my own league. But there's no way for me to delete the league that I created. And there's no way to change the team nickname I wrote in incorrectly once I've created my own league. That's going to be a theme here. This game looks nice and plays nice, but there are all these really strange limitations that prevent you from performing really basic tasks. I think that the manual had additional instructions, though it's been over 30 years since I last looked at it, and I can't find a scanned copy anywhere. And we'll get into why this game is so unloved pretty quickly. The simulation module looks great. The play-by-play text is fantastic. And the game, well, it sort of plays itself. You basically substitute players in and out, and that's really it. Now, you can change your offensive pace, you can choose to double team, play more strict defense, and so on. But for the most part, you just sit back and watch what happens. It's kind of a game that plays itself. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if you watch a lot of basketball, you know that the coach doesn't, run out onto the court to tell a player to penetrate or to take the outside shot or to move back to shoot a three. In fact, that's one of the issues that I've got with the Stratomatic Basketball Advanced game. There's a little bit too much choice in that game as far as I'm concerned. But at the same time, it would be nice to do a little bit more with this one. I mean, you can call a play, though it's really awkward. When I tried it, the players just didn't do it. Now, the worst part is that you can't see the positions each player is supposed to play while they're on the court. You have to pause the game and look at the roster screen. It takes a while to get to the screen, and even then you don't know what the primary position of each player is. Now, it doesn't really matter all that much since the game automatically assigns the players to positions on the court, as you can see here. However, there is no possible way for you as the coach to assign players to certain positions, which is a major flaw. I mean, isn't that something that the coach should have, control over? In fact, every other basketball sim that I could find has this as a basic functionality. It's cool that the players figure it out themselves, but if they're going to do all of this themselves, then why am I even here? There was a really long APBA Journal article about this back in May 1992, actually. And the most important part of the article is buried in the middle, the talk about defensive matchups. The interesting thing was that Ralph Rhodes noted that defense was the hardest thing to recreate and implied that he had done some magic to make defense work right. But when you look at the stats that the game includes, there's nothing beyond the most basic defensive stats: steals, blocks, rebounds, and fouls. There are no defensive ratings and nothing to let you know who is a better defender at which position. In the play-by-play text itself, defense hardly ever comes up. Now, there are 24-second shot clock violations, though these seem to be blamed on offensive ineptitude, not because the defense forced them. And by the way, I also never saw a pick and roll. Additionally, most fast breaks seem to end up in multiple passes, which just isn't right. Watch any 1991-92 game and you'll see what I mean. It's almost like the programmer had never bothered to actually watch the sport. Now, I know I'm being harsh and I might be a little bit too over the top here, and yeah, I know that every game struggles to get things like the pick and roll right, but seriously, you need to have defense in your game at the very least. Stratomatic's advanced game actually has a fine defensive system for individuals, and the team defense concept is extremely good. I like it a lot. Replay has an excellent defensive system inspired by its baseball game. The gold standard, of course, is Mickey's Fast Break, which has separate defensive ratings for each position that each player played. And even the APBA board game had defensive indexes. That might be in Cactus Basketball, though honestly we have no way of knowing, and defense isn't the only issue, by the way. When you play the game, you'll see these little T's show up by each player. That means that the player is tired and that he needs to go out. I don't know exactly how the system works, though it seems to be connected with the number of minutes per game each player had in real life. If you overuse guys who hardly ever played, they get this double T symbol and are extremely tired. I get the feeling that the system was designed to prevent the computer from overusing fringe players with good rate statistics when you do autoplay. And that makes sense, sure, but it also causes some really strange things to happen. At the end of my third game, the Indiana Pacers, who I was coaching, had 4 players who were extremely tired. There was nothing we could do. We didn't have enough players to keep everybody fresh. Interestingly enough, early reports of this game were that exhausted players weren't punished enough by the game engine. My experience was different. Once players were exhausted, they were worse than useless. And the auto roster feature, it's also wrong. I mean, there are transactions in that thing that are just simply wrong. Chuck Pearson was listed as unavailable for the Pacers' first game, for example. Actually, he played 33 minutes in that game in real life. It's crazy. I have no idea how I was supposed to compete in the game without one of the team's top players. And if you look at that box score again, you'll notice that the Pacers only used 9 players all game and Dreiling only played for 7 minutes. In other words, this fatigue system in the computer game seems to be a little bit out of proportion. And remember, we're not talking about a game that was designed in 2025. We're talking about a game that was made in 1991. This is back when it was more common for starters to play more than 40 minutes a game. Now, I don't know how that fatigue system impacts a full replay, but I'm really interested to figure that out, find out more. There are a couple of other odd things about this game, such as the mandatory timeout system. If you don't call a timeout within the first 6 minutes of each quarter, the game calls one for you automatically. I guess it's good because it means you actually use some of your timeouts, but it's kind of a strange system. Well, the problem here is the same one that all the basketball sims face. Timeouts really don't mean anything in the game. There's no incentive to call one. I find myself never using my timeouts unless I really have to. And honestly, if you're designing a basketball sim and you really want to make it stand out, you need to figure out a way to make timeouts actually meaningful. Anyway, all that nitpicking aside, the game actually is really playable and it's a lot of fun. The APBA Journal reported that at least the college version of the game seemed to be pretty accurate, though I don't think this was a completely unbiased examination. Actually, if you ask me, I'd say that these scores are a little bit low. But again, there's really no way for me to measure any of this without doing a full project by myself. And, well, it takes about a half hour to complete a single game at the pace that I'm playing. So bear with me, this one will take quite a few months at least. Now the game itself is what it is, and I honestly do like the DOS game, warts and all. The company, however, is a completely different story. Cactus apparently did a little bit of advertising for its game back in 1993. This advertisement comes from the May 1993 issue of Computer Gaming World. The company's reputation for customer service, however, was nothing short of awful. This old Usenet thread from 2000 is from a customer who was upset that the company made absolutely no improvements to any of its products for years and then responded rudely to the customer's inquiries despite the almost $2,000 this customer had spent. Others indicated that Rhodes had been known for poor behavior in the past. More recent threads on various Delphi forums confirmed that the company had an awful reputation for customer service. Now, if you read closely, you'll realize that many of these problems come from the Windows version of the game, not the original DOS game. I don't know when the Windows version came out, though I think it was probably sometime around like 1997 or 1998. I never got it. By that time, I'd moved on to video game emulation. I'm not even curious about the Windows version, though. I really prefer my good memories with the DOS game. Now, we can also look back and see how the company progressed through its own website. By 1997, it seems that they had a version of every season from 1954-55 to the present. In 2006, they came out with some sort of set of all-time All-Star discs. This is a copy of the website from December 2024, which is the last working version I could find. Now, unfortunately, none of these screenshots have been archived, but if you squint a little bit, you can see that the game for Windows was essentially the same text-based game that it was back in the DOS days. And I use the past tense here for a reason. That reason is because it seems Cactus League Basketball no longer exists. The Cactus League Games website has expired. So has the old Cactus development website, and both pages have been like this for 6 months. The problem, of course, is that the most recent versions of the game required a connection to the Cactus development server every couple of days. In other words, the most recent versions of the game are now completely unplayable. That's just more fuel to the fire created by these posts, and more evidence that the company itself was simply awful. It's also a reason to support initiatives such as Stop Killing Games. I strongly believe that people should be entitled to continue playing games they paid for even after companies like Cactus go out of business. It's not right for games to simply stop working because of managerial incompetence. So if you happen to know what happened to this company, please let me know. And honestly, if you have old discs for the DOS professional game, please let me know as well. Despite my complaints, I really would like to play this game more, and I would be interested in any DOS versions of the program, no matter how old. When you look at the game itself, it actually isn't that bad. It's not perfect, sure, but it's one of the better basketball simulators I've played with, and it's a lot of fun. I've still never been able to figure out just how closely related the game is to the old APBA Basketball board game. It honestly seems to me to be a completely original game, but I'm curious to know what others think. The customer service, however, was not just bad, it was apparently almost beyond description in terms of how awful it was. In fact, there are so many examples of this poor behavior on the part of the company on so many different forums that you simply can't miss them. For a company that never had its own official forum, you would think that they would have wanted to at least counter some of the bad publicity that they were receiving all over the place. Anyway, I really think that this company's gone for good. Sadly, this game will likely wind up on the abandonware shelf, appreciated only by a few of us. But the old DOS game is really good, if you can find a working copy, that is. Anyway, as always, if you know more, please let me know down below in the comments. Meanwhile, I've got a ton of games to play if I want to get this replay done.